Ladies and gentlemen, we often think transformation has to come from complexity, that if we want to change our lives, we need to adopt 11 new habits, master 11 new strategies, follow 11 different people online, read 11 more books. But what if I told you that sometimes the most profound change starts not with 11 things, but with just one? This idea hit me when I was at a point where I was drowning in self-help. I had journals filled with bullet points, schedules blocked out by the hour, motivational quotes stuck to my mirror, but I was exhausted. I wasn't moving forward. I was just spinning in place with more tools than I could carry. And then something shifted. I stopped asking, what else do I need? And started asking, what's already working? That's when I realized it wasn't about adding more. It was about going deeper with less. Psychologically, this comes down to what we call cognitive load. The idea that our brains can only hold and process so much at once. When we overload ourselves with too many concepts or rules, we dilute our ability to act on any of them meaningfully. But when we simplify, when we center on one principle, we create clarity. And with clarity comes action. For me, that principle was discipline. Not in the punishing sense, but in the way Jocko Willink or Epictetus might describe it. Discipline as freedom. The ability to say no to what doesn't align. The power to show up even when the motivation isn't there. Once I fully internalized that, everything else began to align around it. Focus improved. Confidence followed. And then came the courage to say yes to the right things and no to the noise. Philosophically, there's something ancient about this. The Stoics, for example, weren't trying to master dozens of life hacks. They aimed for internal mastery through a single virtue: wisdom, courage, justice, temperance, depending on who you read. But the principle was singular and deeply rooted. They didn't scatter their efforts, they channeled them. And from that came a coherent, resilient life. There's a psychological elegance in narrowing your focus. Think about it. When you choose one principle, you give yourself a lens through which to interpret everything else. It's like cleaning a dirty window. You don't need a new view, you just need to see clearly. And the beauty is, once you lock in on that one principle, you'll find it quietly shapes the rest. Discipline leads to consistency. Consistency builds confidence. Confidence invites opportunity. Opportunity demands courage. One leads to the next, not because you chased all of them, but because you mastered one. And that's what I mean when I say simplicity is power. The kind of power that isn't loud but deep. The kind of power that doesn't impress others, it transforms. We tend to believe that growth requires doing more. But real growth, it often starts with doing less, but doing it with intention, with clarity, and with commitment. So here's my challenge to you. Don't rush to grab all 11 principles. Find the one that resonates with you most right now. Not the one that sounds best, the one that hits, that echoes somewhere in your gut, and go all in on that. Let it do its quiet work. Let it lead. You'll be surprised how the others start showing up without a fight. Because sometimes the fastest way to transformation is not by running faster, but by walking with purpose in a single direction. There's a subtle but powerful distinction we often miss when we talk about personal growth. It's the difference between addition and integration. And I want to spend a few minutes unpacking that, because it was this shift, not a new habit, not a motivational high, but this shift in how I approached change that quietly redefined my life. Most people think the key to transformation is stacking things. More knowledge, more skills, more routines. They build what I call self-improvement towers, layer after layer of good intentions. But eventually those towers get wobbly because without a foundation that connects it all, it collapses under its own weight. What I learned, and what I want you to consider, is that transformation doesn't stick when you add principles on top of your life. It sticks when you integrate a principle into your life so deeply that it changes the structure of how you operate. Let me explain it this way. Think about integrity. If you truly internalize integrity, not just as a value you nod to, but as a lens for every decision, then it becomes something you carry into every conversation, every email, every quiet moment where no one's watching. It's not a layer you apply. It's a framework that defines who you are, whether anyone sees it or not. Psychologically, this goes back to identity theory. We don't change because we do different things. We change because we start to see ourselves different. Integration means aligning your behavior with who you believe you are. When you identify as someone who embodies a principle, say patience, you don't try to be patient. You simply respond through that lens because that's who you are. Now that's the level of change that lasts. Now here's the philosophical depth to that. Integration demands alignment, and alignment demands discomfort. Why? Because to truly integrate a principle, something else usually has to go. You have to let old beliefs. You have to sit with contradictions long enough to resolve them, not ignore them. It's easy to wear a principle like a mask when it's convenient. It's much harder to let it reorder your priorities, your rhythms, and even your relationships. But that's where transformation actually happens. When I integrated the principle of intentionality into my life, I had to confront how often I was on autopilot. Not just in tasks, but in relationships, in the way I consumed information, even in how I spoke. I couldn't unsee the dissonance between what I said I valued and what I actually prioritized. That's when I knew the principle had taken root, because it wasn't something I had to remember to practice. It became the standard by which everything else was measured. This is where most people fall off. They treat principles like patches, temporary fixes for deeper misalignment. But patches fall off. Integration rewrites the code. And when you integrate a principle fully, it quietly begins to shape every domain of your life. You become more congruent, more grounded, and surprisingly more free. Because you're no longer fragmented. You're no longer performing different roles depending on the situation. You're consistent whole, and people feel that even if they can't name it. So if you want to see real change, lasting change, don't just look for another principle to tack on. Look for one you're willing to live from, one that you're ready to let disrupt you, refine you, and ultimately guide you. Integration is quieter than addition, but it's also deepened, and deeper is what we're after. Because at the end of the day, transformation isn't about how much you can carry. It's about what you're willing to carry all the way through. One of the biggest turning points in my journey came when I realized that alignment isn't just a buzzword, it's the accelerator. When people talk about growth, they usually focus on effort. Grind harder, push further. But what happens when all that effort is pointed in the wrong direction? You don't just waste time, you burn out. And that's what I did for years. I was doing a lot of things right, just not in the right order, or for the right reasons. I wasn't out of fuel, I was just out of alignment. Here's what I mean by that. When your values, your goals, and your daily actions are aligned, when they're pointing in the same direction, you don't have to force momentum. It happens naturally. It's like rowing a boat with the current instead of against it. You still have to row, but you're not exhausting yourself fighting your own direction. Psychologically, this has a lot to do with cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable tension we feel when we say one thing but do another. When we claim to value health but neglect sleep, when we talk about growth but refuse feedback, that dissonance wears on us. It creates internal friction. We may not always notice it, but it slows us down, drains our focus, and quietly eats at our confidence. And the antidote to that is alignment. Alignment doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean every day is flawless. What it means is that your choices are consistent with your principles, not occasionally but as a pattern. That's where integrity lies. That's where peace comes from. Not because life is easy, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. Philosophically, this traces back to something the ancient Greeks understood well. Eudaimonia, a kind of deep, flourishing well-being that comes not from pleasure but from living in harmony with your highest. In modern terms, we might call it fulfillment. And fulfillment doesn't come from just achieving goals. It comes from knowing that the goals you're chasing match who you really are. That's alignment. And when you find it, things begin to move. This is why when you fully commit to one principle and then integrate it like we talked about, you start to notice something strange. Things accelerate, not just externally like promotions or progress, but internally. Your confidence builds faster, your relationships shift more naturally, your decision-making gets sharper. That's not magic, that's alignment in motion. Let me give you a practical example. When I aligned my days around the principle of clarity, I stopped overcommitting. I stopped saying yes out of guilt and started saying no with intention. And guess what? My time freed up, my work deepened, my relationships grew more honest. I wasn't doing more, I was just doing what mattered. Because when your principle, your schedule, and your mindset are aligned, there's no wasted motion, and no wasted energy. People often ask, how do you stay consistent? The answer is alignment removes the need for constant willpower. When your life is built around what you genuinely believe in, discipline isn't a struggle, it's a natural byproduct. You're not pushing anymore. You're pulled by something deeper, and that's what I want to leave you with today. Stop trying to force momentum. Start asking yourself, is what I'm doing aligned with who I want to become? If the answer is no, don't double down, realign. Because momentum that comes from alignment doesn't just move you faster, it moves you further with far less resistance. Alignment doesn't guarantee ease, but it does guarantee clarity. And with clarity, transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable.